Have you ever wondered what it would be like if someone from the future looked back at our time, at this very moment you're experiencing right now, and tried to understand how we lived? What would seem strange to them? What would they find impossible to comprehend about the way we move through our days, the way we love, the way we suffer, the way we hope? In the year 2300, Marcus Chen 7742 received what should have been a routine assignment from the Neo-Stanford Institute of Temporal Studies. His thesis topic seemed straightforward enough: daily emotional fluctuations in pre-enhancement humans, a study of 2024 psychological patterns. What his professors didn't tell him was that understanding the emotional lives of people from our era would require more than reading archived data streams or analyzing preserved neural patterns. It would require him to live among us. The morning Marcus received his temporal displacement authorization, he stood in his dormitory unit 847 floors above what used to be called San Francisco Bay, looking out at the crystalline spires that had replaced the ancient city below. The year 2300 had brought humanity many gifts: emotional regulation implants that eliminated unnecessary suffering, neural efficiency boosters that optimized every thought, and social harmony protocols that had ended conflict centuries ago. Life was perfect, peaceful, and utterly predictable. Which was precisely why Marcus's thesis advisor, Professor Lin 9981, believed that studying the chaotic emotional landscape of 2024 would provide crucial insights into human development. The pre-enhancement humans, Professor Lin had explained during their final briefing, experienced what they called feelings in ways that seem almost incomprehensible to us now. They would allow these emotional fluctuations to drive major life decisions, to cause physical illness, even to end their own existence. Your job is to understand how this was possible. Marcus had nodded confidently, his emotion regulators keeping him in the optimal state of focused curiosity. How difficult could it be to observe and document the primitive emotional responses of his ancestors? The temporal displacement itself was unremarkable. One moment he stood in the gleaming displacement chamber of 2300, the next he found himself in the grimy back alley of what his historical databases identified as Brooklyn, New York, in October 2024. The first thing that hit him wasn't the visual chaos of the primitive cityscape, or even the overwhelming cacophony of unregulated sounds. It was the smell. In 2300, air was perfectly filtered and climate-controlled. Marcus had never experienced the complex mixture of exhaust fumes, cooking food, human sweat, and organic decay that assaulted his senses the moment he materialized in 2024. His enhancement suit had prepared him for the lower oxygen levels and increased pollution, but nothing could have prepared him for the sheer sensory overload of existing in an unoptimized environment. The displacement team had provided him with period-appropriate clothing, currency, and identity documents. According to his fabricated records, Marcus Chen was a 23-year-old graduate student at Brooklyn College, studying sociology. His manufactured backstory included a childhood in California, parents who worked in technology, and a passion for understanding human behavior. None of it was true, but it would serve his purposes. What Marcus hadn't anticipated was how difficult it would be to simply exist in 2024 without the technological support systems he'd known his entire life. In 2300, his neural implants handled everything from navigation to social interaction protocols. They regulated his sleep cycles, optimized his nutrition, and maintained his emotional stability. Here in this primitive time, he was on his own. The first week nearly broke him. Marcus had rented a small apartment in Park Slope using the historical currency his handlers had provided. The space was tiny by 2300 standards, barely 400 square feet, and lacked even the most basic environmental controls. The temperature fluctuated wildly, requiring him to physically adjust something called a thermostat. There were no food synthesizers. Instead, he had to purchase organic matter from primitive vendors and prepare it using thermal applications. But the most disturbing aspect of 2024 life wasn't the inconvenience, it was the way his own mind began to change. Without his emotion regulators, Marcus found himself experiencing sensations he had no framework to understand. On his third day, while struggling to operate the primitive food preparation devices in his apartment, he felt something rise in his chest, a hot, pressing feeling that made his hands shake and his breathing become irregular. In 2300, he would have simply modulated the sensation away. Here he was forced to experience what his historical databases identified as frustration in its raw, unfiltered form. It was terrifying and somehow fascinating. Marcus began keeping detailed observational notes, documenting his own emotional responses as much as those of the primitive humans around him. He discovered that emotions in 2024 weren't just inconvenient fluctuations to be corrected. They were complex, layered experiences that seemed to carry information, even wisdom. The first person who truly challenged his understanding was Sarah Martinez, a barista at the coffee shop where Marcus had begun conducting his observational research. Sarah was 26 years old, worked 2 jobs to support her younger brother through college, and possessed what Marcus initially categorized as excessive emotional volatility. She would cry during movies, laugh until tears formed at jokes that weren't objectively humorous, and experience what she called bad days where her entire demeanor shifted. From Marcus's 2300 perspective, Sarah's emotional patterns were deeply inefficient. Her sadness served no productive purpose, her joy was often triggered by trivial stimuli, and her anger seemed to make her less capable of rational decision-making. By all the metrics of his time, she was operating at a significant psychological disadvantage. But as weeks passed, Marcus began to notice something his training hadn't prepared him for. Sarah's emotions weren't just random fluctuations. They were responses to a complex web of relationships, experiences, and meaning that gave her life a richness his perfectly regulated existence lacked. When Sarah cried during movies, she wasn't experiencing a malfunction. She was connecting with stories, empathizing with characters, experiencing beauty and tragedy in ways that made her more compassionate in her real-world relationships. Her laughter wasn't inefficient. It bonded her with friends, reduced stress, and created shared moments of joy that strengthened her social connections. Even her anger, which Marcus had initially dismissed as purely destructive, often motivated her to stand up for injustice, to protect people she cared about, to fight for causes she believed in. The revelation shook Marcus's understanding of human psychology. In 2300, emotions had been optimized out of existence because they were viewed as obstacles to rational thinking and social harmony. But watching Sarah navigate her daily life, Marcus began to wonder if something essential had been lost in the process. His thesis research took on new urgency as he realized he wasn't just studying primitive humans, he was witnessing a form of consciousness that no longer existed in his time. Marcus began expanding his observational scope, spending time in places where 2024 humans gathered and expressed emotions freely. He sat in parks, watching families interact, observing how children's unregulated joy could transform the mood of entire groups. He attended concerts where thousands of people shared collective emotional experiences, their individual feelings amplifying and harmonizing with others. He visited hospitals where he witnessed both devastating grief and overwhelming love, often experienced simultaneously by the same person. Each observation challenged his preconceptions. In 2300, efficiency and optimization were the highest values. But in 2024, he observed humans consistently choosing inefficient paths because they were more meaningful, more beautiful, or more connected to their values and relationships. The most profound shift in Marcus's understanding came during his second month in 2024, when Sarah invited him to her brother's college graduation. Marcus attended as part of his research, expecting to observe and document family bonding behaviors and achievement celebration rituals. What he experienced instead was something his emotional vocabulary couldn't adequately describe. As Sarah's brother walked across the stage to receive his diploma, Marcus watched Sarah's face transform. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she applauded, her joy so intense it seemed to radiate from her entire being. But mixed with the happiness was something else, a bittersweet awareness that this moment represented both an ending and a beginning, that her brother's achievement was also his step toward independence from the family that had sacrificed so much to support him. In 2300, such mixed emotions would have been immediately regulated into a more stable, productive state, but watching Sarah experience the full complexity of pride, joy, love, and loss simultaneously, Marcus realized that the emotional optimization of his era hadn't just eliminated suffering in it, it had eliminated the deep richness of human experience. For the first time since his arrival in 2024, Marcus felt something that his training had never prepared him for: envy. He envied Sarah's ability to feel so deeply, to experience meaning and connection with such intensity. His perfectly regulated emotional state suddenly felt not like an advancement, but like a profound loss. This realization sent Marcus into what 2024 humans would recognize as an existential crisis, though in 2300 such experiences had been eliminated, along with other inefficient psychological states. He began questioning not just his thesis, but the entire foundation of his civilization's approach to human consciousness and emotional experience. The crisis deepened when Marcus received his monthly check-in communication from Professor Lin 9981. The message arrived through his quantum communicator, a device hidden in what appeared to be a primitive smartphone. Subject progress report required. The message read in the emotionally neutral tone of 2300 academic communication. Submit preliminary findings on pre-enhancement emotional dysfunction patterns. Emphasis on documenting inefficiencies and maladaptive responses for historical record. Reading the message, Marcus realized that his professor, and by extension, his entire civilization, had fundamentally misunderstood what they were studying. They weren't documenting dysfunction or inefficiency. They were examining a form of consciousness that was richer, more complex, and arguably more human than anything that existed in 2300. But how could he explain this to people who had never experienced unregulated emotion? How could he make them understand that what they saw as primitive might actually represent something irreplaceable that had been lost? Marcus decided to extend his research timeline, sending word back to 2300 that he needed additional months to fully document the complexity of pre-enhancement emotional systems.
And this wasn't entirely dishonesty.
He did need more time to understand what he was observing. But his real motivation was deeper. He wasn't ready to return to the emotionally sterile environment of his own time. As winter settled over Brooklyn, Marcus found himself experiencing seasonal affective responses that his databases described, but that he had never imagined could be so profound. The shorter days and colder weather didn't just change his environment, they changed his internal landscape. He felt what 2024 humans called melancholy, a gentle sadness that wasn't entirely unpleasant, mixed with a contemplative awareness of life's transience. In 2300, such responses would have been immediately corrected with light therapy and neural adjustment. But experiencing seasonal emotional shifts naturally, Marcus discovered they carried their own wisdom. The melancholy made him more reflective, more appreciative of warmth and light when they appeared, more attuned to subtle changes in his environment and relationships. It was during this winter period that Marcus made a discovery that would fundamentally alter his thesis and ultimately his life. He was sitting in Sarah's coffee shop on a particularly gray December morning, observing the ways customers' moods shifted in response to weather, when he overheard a conversation that stopped him cold. An elderly man at the neighboring table was talking to his adult daughter about his recent diagnosis with early-stage dementia. The conversation should have been purely tragic. The man was facing the gradual loss of his memories, his independence, his very sense of self. But what Marcus observed was far more complex. "I'm scared," the man admitted to his daughter, his voice shaking slightly. "But I'm also grateful. Grateful for all the memories I have now. Grateful for this time with you. Grateful that I can still recognize the people I love." His daughter reached across the table and took his hand. "We'll face this together, Dad, every step of the way." Watching this interaction, Marcus witnessed something that couldn't exist in 2300, the simultaneous experience of fear and gratitude, sorrow and love, despair and hope. The emotional complexity wasn't a malfunction to be corrected. It was allowing this family to navigate an impossible situation with grace, connection, and meaning. In 2300, the man's condition would have been prevented by genetic optimization, or if it somehow occurred, his emotional distress would have been regulated away, leaving only calm acceptance. But in doing so, would they have lost the profound beauty of his gratitude, the deep love expressed between father and daughter, the courage required to face uncertainty together? That night, Marcus sat in his small apartment and began writing what he knew would be a controversial thesis. Instead of documenting the inefficiencies of pre-enhancement emotional systems, he found himself arguing for their essential value. He wrote about emotions not as obstacles to overcome, but as sources of wisdom, connection, and meaning that his civilization had sacrificed in its pursuit of optimization. But as he wrote, Marcus faced a dilemma that went beyond academic concerns. His research period was scheduled to end in 3 months. He would return to 2300, submit his thesis, and resume his life as a perfectly regulated citizen of the future. The emotional experiences he had discovered in 2024 would be dampened by his reactivated implants until they became distant memories of a primitive time. The thought filled him with something he now recognized as grief. Marcus had expected his time in 2024 to be difficult, educational, and ultimately temporary, a brief academic exercise before returning to his superior future life. Instead, he had discovered forms of consciousness and experience that made his original existence feel impoverished. As spring arrived in Brooklyn, bringing with it the renewal and hope that 2024 humans associated with the changing seasons, Marcus made a decision that would have been impossible for the emotionally regulated person he had been when he arrived. He decided to stay. The choice wasn't made lightly. Remaining in 2024 meant abandoning his academic career, his family connections in 2300, and all the technological advantages of his time. It meant accepting a shorter lifespan, greater physical discomfort, and the constant emotional turbulence that 2024 humans navigated daily. But it also meant keeping the capacity for wonder, for deep love, for meaningful sadness, and for the complex mix of emotions that made existence rich rather than simply efficient. Marcus spent his final weeks before his scheduled return date completing his thesis, but not the one his professors expected. Instead of documenting primitive emotional dysfunction, he wrote a comprehensive argument for the value of unregulated human consciousness. He described emotions not as bugs in the human system, but as features-matched complex responses that provided crucial information about values, relationships, and meaning. His thesis concluded with a radical proposition that the emotional optimization of 2300, while eliminating suffering, had also eliminated much of what made life worth living. He recommended that future temporal research focus not on understanding how to improve upon primitive emotional systems, but on learning how to reintegrate some of their richness into optimized life. When the time came for his scheduled retrieval, Marcus simply didn't report to the temporal displacement coordinates. His quantum communicator carried increasingly urgent messages from Professor Lin 9981, demanding explanations for his absence. Marcus responded with a brief message explaining his decision to remain in 2024 to continue his research indefinitely. The response from 2300 was swift and predictable. Marcus's temporal citizenship was revoked, his access to future technology was terminated, and he was officially classified as a temporal defector. From the perspective of his original time, he had chosen to strand himself in a primitive era rather than return to paradise. But as Marcus walked through Prospect Park on a warm spring morning, feeling the unfiltered sunlight on his face and experiencing the complex mixture of loss, liberation, and hope that came with his choice, he knew he had made the right decision. He had discovered something in 2024 that didn't exist in 2300, the messy, inefficient, beautiful experience of being fully human. Sarah found him sitting on a bench near the lake, staring at the water with an expression she had learned to recognize over the months of their friendship, the look of someone processing something profound. "You seem different lately," she said, settling beside him, "like you're seeing everything for the first time." Marcus smiled, feeling the complex mix of sadness and joy that her observation triggered. In a way, he was seeing everything for the first time, through eyes that could feel as well as observe. "I've been thinking about what makes life meaningful," he said, "and I think I'm starting to understand that it's not about avoiding difficulty or optimizing experiences, it's about feeling them fully, even when they're hard." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "That's very wise for a sociology student," she teased gently. "Almost like you're from another time or something." If only she knew, Marcus thought, experiencing what he now recognized as ironic amusement, an emotion that simply couldn't exist in the perfect clarity of 2300. As the months turned into years, Marcus built a new life in 2024. He finished his fabricated graduate degree and became a therapist, using his unique perspective to help people navigate the emotional complexities that his original time had optimized away. He learned to experience love, heartbreak, friendship, disappointment, and joy without the safety net of emotional regulation. It wasn't easy. There were days when the intensity of unfiltered emotion felt overwhelming, when he understood why his ancestors had eventually chosen to regulate these experiences away. But there were also moments of connection, beauty, and meaning that made every difficult day worthwhile. Marcus never forgot his origins or the civilization he had left behind. Sometimes, late at night, he would wonder about the life he might have lived in 2300, the perfect existence he had abandoned. But these moments of doubt were always balanced by the rich complexity of his chosen life. He had learned something that his professors could never have taught him in a classroom, that the goal of human existence wasn't to eliminate suffering or optimize experience, but to live fully in all its messy, inefficient, beautiful complexity. Years later, when Marcus was an old man by 2024 standards, he would sometimes sit in the same coffee shop where he had first observed Sarah and think about the student from 2300 who had come to study primitive humans. That young man had expected to document dysfunction and return to paradise. Instead, he had discovered that paradise might not be a place of perfect efficiency and optimized emotions. It might be right here, in the imperfect present, among people brave enough to feel everything life offered them. As the sun set over Brooklyn, casting long shadows through the coffee shop window, Marcus reflected on the thesis he had never submitted to his professors in 2300. His real research had concluded with a simple but profound discovery, that the capacity to suffer and the capacity to find life meaningful were inextricably linked, and that any attempt to eliminate one inevitably diminished the other. He had chosen meaning over efficiency, complexity over optimization, humanity over perfection. And in doing so, he had found something worth staying for much, not just in 2024, but in any time where people were still brave enough to feel deeply, love fully, and face the beautiful uncertainty of an unoptimized existence. The student from 2300 had completed his thesis after all. He had just chosen to live it rather than write it. But Marcus's story was far from over. His decision to remain in 2024 would have consequences he couldn't have imagined, rippling through time in ways that would challenge everything both eras believed about progress, consciousness, and what it meant to be human. 3 years after his defection, Marcus received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Elena Vasquez appeared in his Brooklyn apartment on a Tuesday morning in 2027, materializing in the same shimmering displacement field that had brought Marcus to this time. But unlike Marcus, Elena came with official authorization and a specific mission to bring him home. "Hello, Marcus," she said, her voice carrying the familiar emotional neutrality of 2300. "I'm Dr. Vasquez, from the Temporal Ethics Review Board. We need to talk." Marcus looked up from the therapy notes he'd been reviewing for his afternoon patients. 3 years of living in 2024 had changed him visibly. His face carried lines of expression that wouldn't have existed in his emotionally regulated original timeline, and his eyes held a depth that came from experiencing unfiltered human experience. "I'm not going back," he said simply. "I thought I made that clear." Elena settled into the worn armchair across from him, her perfect posture and serene expression a stark contrast to the lived-in comfort of Marcus's apartment. "Your thesis created quite a stir in academic circles. Your arguments about the value of unregulated emotional experience have been controversial. Controversial enough to send someone after me. Controversial enough to change policy," Elena admitted. "The Temporal Ethics Review Board has been studying your preliminary findings for the past year. Your observations about the connection between emotional complexity and meaning-making have triggered a comprehensive review of our enhancement protocols." Marcus felt something he now recognized as skepticism mixed with hope, a combination that would have been impossible in his original timeline. "What kind of review?" Elena reached into her displacement pack and withdrew a device Marcus didn't recognize. "We're implementing a pilot program. Selected volunteers from 2300 are being temporarily disconnected from their emotional regulation systems to experience what you've documented. The early results are significant." The device projected a holographic display showing brain scans and neural activity patterns. Marcus recognized some of the data formats from his original training, but the readings themselves were unlike anything he'd seen in 2300 research. "These are scans from volunteers who've been experiencing unregulated emotions for 30 days, Elena explained. "Look at the neural pathway development, the increased connectivity between cognitive and emotional processing centers. Their brains are literally rewiring themselves." Marcus studied the scans, feeling a familiar mixture of scientific fascination and personal vindication. "What are they reporting experientially?" "That's where it gets interesting," Elena said, and for the first time Marcus detected what might have been excitement in her voice. "They're describing experiences that don't exist in our current vocabulary, feelings that seem to carry information, emotional states that enhance rather than impair decision-making, and something they keep referring to as meaning that goes beyond our standard definitions." "And the review board's response?" Elena was quiet for a moment, and Marcus realized she was experiencing something his 2300 training would have identified as uncertainty, an emotional state that had been optimized out of existence in their time. "They want you to come back," she said finally. "Not as a student, but as a researcher. They want you to design a controlled study examining the potential benefits of selective emotional deregulation. Your 3 years of field experience make you uniquely qualified to bridge the gap between our understanding and theirs." Marcus felt the familiar complexity of mixed emotions, pride at being recognized, excitement about the research possibilities, but also apprehension about returning to a world that had once felt like home but now seemed sterile by comparison. "What about the people here?" he asked. "My patients, my friends, the life I've built?" "The temporal displacement would be temporary," Elena explained. 6 months to design and implement the initial study, then you could choose whether to stay or return." "But Marcus," she paused, and he could see her struggling with concepts her regulated mind hadn't been trained to process. "There's something else you need to know." She activated another holographic display, this one showing population statistics and social indicators from 2300. "Since we began the emotional deregulation trials, we've seen significant changes in our society. Birth rates are increasing for the first time in decades. Artistic expression is flourishing. People are forming deeper social connections, taking creative risks, even falling in love." Marcus stared at the data, realizing he was witnessing the early stages of a transformation that could reshape human civilization. They're rediscovering what it means to be human. Yes, but there's resistance. A significant portion of the population views these changes as regression, as a dangerous return to primitive emotional states. They're calling for the trials to be terminated and for stronger regulation protocols. That's why we need you. Elena leaned forward, and Marcus saw something in her expression that he never would have expected from someone from 2300. Desperation. You've lived in both worlds, Marcus. You understand the costs and benefits of each approach. Without your research and guidance, we might lose this opportunity to evolve beyond our current limitations, or worse, we might swing too far in the other direction and lose the advances we've made. Marcus stood and walked to his window, looking out at the bustling street below. In 3 years, he had watched Sarah fall in love, get married, and have a child. He had helped dozens of patients work through complex emotional challenges that would have been simply regulated away in 2300. He had experienced seasons, grief, joy, and the 1,000 small moments that made life rich, rather than simply efficient. But he had also witnessed the darker sides of unregulated emotion. He had seen patients destroyed by depression, families torn apart by anger, communities divided by fear and prejudice. The emotional complexity he had learned to value came with real costs. If I come back, he said finally, I work on my terms. No regulation of my emotional state, no interference with my research methodology, and complete honesty about what we're trying to achieve. Elena nodded, agreed, but Marcus, you should know me now. You won't be the only one. We're bringing back several temporal researchers who've spent extended time in various historical periods. We're calling it Project Renaissance. Renaissance? A rebirth, the chance to reclaim aspects of human experience we may have lost in our pursuit of optimization. Elena stood, preparing to activate her displacement device. Will you come? Marcus looked around his apartment, at the photos of friends he'd made, at the evidence of a life lived fully in all its messy complexity. Then he thought about the data Elena had shown him, about an entire civilization on the brink of rediscovering what it meant to feel deeply. Give me a week to arrange things here, he said. I'll need to refer my patients to other therapists and say goodbye to the family I've chosen. When Elena departed, Marcus sat in the silence of his apartment and experienced something he now recognized as anticipation tinged with sadness, the bittersweet awareness that every choice involved loss as well as gain. The week that followed was among the most emotionally complex of Marcus's time in 2024. He spent hours with each of his patients, helping them transition to new therapists, while processing his own feelings about leaving. He had dinner with Sarah and her family, struggling to explain why he needed to go away for several months without revealing the truth of his origins. You've been like family to us, Sarah told him over coffee on his last evening in Brooklyn. Whatever this research opportunity is, I hope it gives you what you're looking for. What do you think I'm looking for? Marcus asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. Sarah considered the question carefully. I think you're looking for a way to help people live more fully. You have this way of seeing beauty in things that hurt, of finding meaning in experiences that most people just want to get through. Maybe you're looking for a way to share that gift with more people. Her words stayed with him as he prepared for his return to 2300. In trying to understand the primitive humans of 2024, he had discovered something profound about the nature of human experience itself. Now he had the chance to bring that understanding back to his own time. The displacement back to 2300 was disorienting in ways his original journey had not been. In 2024, he had been moving from advanced to primitive, from optimized to chaotic. Now he was returning from richness to sterility, from emotional complexity to regulated simplicity. The Neo-Stanford Institute looked exactly as he remembered it. Gleaming surfaces, perfect climate control, and the serene efficiency that had once seemed like paradise. But after 3 years of living among people who laughed until they cried and grieved until they healed, the perfection felt hollow. Professor Lin 9981 greeted him in the same emotionally neutral tone he remembered, but Marcus now recognized it as the absence of feeling rather than the presence of control. The professor's questions about his research were technically sophisticated, but missed the deeper implications of what he had discovered. Your preliminary reports suggest that pre-enhancement emotional states may have had adaptive functions, Professor Lin said during their debriefing. How do we separate the beneficial aspects from the clearly maladaptive responses like grief, anxiety, and anger? You don't, Marcus replied, feeling the strange experience of being the most emotionally expressive person in the room. They're not separate systems. The capacity for deep joy is connected to the capacity for deep sorrow. the ability to feel love requires the vulnerability to experience loss. You can't optimize one without diminishing the other. The professor's expression remained neutral, but Marcus could see the subtle signs of confusion that his enhanced pattern recognition now allowed him to detect. That seems inefficient. Inefficient, maybe, but meaningful, and meaning, it turns out, might be more important than efficiency for human flourishing. Over the following weeks, Marcus threw himself into designing the research protocols for Project Renaissance. Working with the other returned temporal researchers, he developed assessment tools that could measure not just emotional states, but the quality of experience, the depth of relationships, and the sense of purpose that regulated humans in 2300 had largely lost. The volunteers for the emotional deregulation trials came from all sectors of society: scientists, artists, administrators, and even some members of the Temporal Ethics Review Board itself. Each was gradually weaned from their emotional regulation systems over a period of weeks, with constant monitoring to ensure their safety. Marcus served as the primary guide for these volunteers, helping them understand and navigate experiences that their society had forgotten how to process. He taught them that sadness wasn't a malfunction to be corrected but information to be processed. He showed them that anger could motivate positive change, that fear could provide important warnings, and that love could transform not just individuals but entire communities. The results were remarkable. Within months, the volunteers were showing increased creativity, deeper social connections, and a sense of vitality that had been absent from 2300 society for generations. They wrote poetry, fell in love, took creative risks, and found meaning in experiences that their regulated peers found incomprehensible. But the transformation wasn't without challenges. Some volunteers struggled with the intensity of unregulated emotion, requiring careful support to avoid being overwhelmed. Others found the constant fluctuation of feeling exhausting after a lifetime of emotional stability. A few requested to return to their regulated state, finding the richness of unfiltered experience too intense to sustain. Marcus documented all of it, building a comprehensive understanding of how humans could navigate the transition from optimized existence to meaningful living. His work became the foundation for what would eventually be known as the Great Rebalancing, a societal shift that would reshape human civilization's approach to consciousness, emotion, and the purpose of existence. But perhaps the most significant moment of Marcus's return to 2300 came 6 months into the project, when he received an unexpected message through the quantum communication system. It was from Sarah. The message itself was impossible. 2024 technology couldn't send communications to 2300, and Sarah had no knowledge of temporal displacement. But there it was, in the familiar format of his quantum communicator, using language and concepts that could only have come from her. Marcus, the message read, "I don't know how I'm writing this or where it's going, but I had the strangest dream last night. I dreamed about you living in some kind of perfect future, where no one ever felt sad or scared or angry, but also where no one ever felt really truly happy either. In the dream you were teaching people how to feel again, how to live with their whole hearts instead of just their minds. I woke up thinking about something you once said, meaning isn't about avoiding difficulty, it's about feeling it fully. I hope, wherever you are, that you're still helping people discover that truth. Love, Sarah." Marcus stared at the message, feeling the familiar complexity of emotions that he now recognized as one of humanity's greatest gifts: wonder at the impossible communication, gratitude for Sarah's friendship, sadness at the distance between them, and hope for the future he was helping to create. He had set out to study primitive humans and ended up discovering that perhaps they weren't so primitive after all. In their willingness to feel deeply, to love fully, and to find meaning in suffering, they had preserved something essential that his own civilization had lost in its pursuit of perfection. Now, working in the gleaming laboratories of 2300, surrounded by volunteers learning to cry and laugh in hope and fear, Marcus realized that his thesis had become something far greater than an academic exercise. It had become a bridge between two ways of being human: the optimized and the authentic, the efficient and the meaningful. The future he was helping to create wouldn't be a return to the chaotic emotionality of 2024, nor would it maintain the sterile perfection of unmodified 2300. Instead, it would be something new, a synthesis that honored both the wisdom of feeling and the benefits of understanding, both the beauty of vulnerability and the strength of resilience. As he worked late into the night in his laboratory, analyzing data that proved what he had learned through experience, that the capacity to feel deeply was inseparable from the ability to live meaningfully, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He had started as a student from the future studying the past, but somewhere along the way he had become something more: a bridge between eras, a translator between ways of being, and ultimately a reminder that the goal of human advancement shouldn't be to transcend our humanity, but to embrace it more fully. The last entry in Marcus's research journal, written in his laboratory overlooking the crystal spires of New San Francisco, captured the essence of what he had learned. Today I watched Dr. Lin 9981 cry for the first time in his regulated life. He had chosen to participate in the deregulation trials, and today he experienced grief, not over any specific loss, but over the realization of all the moments of beauty and connection he had missed in his optimized existence. His tears weren't a malfunction, they were recognition that in trying to eliminate suffering, we had also eliminated much of what makes life worth living. The volunteers in our program aren't becoming more primitive, they're becoming more human, and perhaps that's the most advanced thing of all, might, to feel deeply, love fully, and find meaning in the magnificent mess of conscious existence. We thought we were perfecting humanity. Instead, we had been editing it. Now finally we're learning to write the full story again. Outside his laboratory window, the sun set over a city that was slowly learning to dream again, and Marcus smiled in an expression that carried all the complexity, hope, and hard-won wisdom of someone who had discovered that the journey toward understanding what it means to be human was not a destination to reach, but a continuous choice to remain open to the full spectrum of experience. The student from 2300 had indeed completed his thesis, and in living it, he had helped an entire civilization remember what they had forgotten in their pursuit of perfection, that being human was not a problem to be solved, but a gift to be fully experienced.